He thought humiliating her would be effortless, but in that room, under those bright white lights, he was seconds away from losing something far more valuable than pride. The lecture hall at Westbridge University was packed, rows of polished oak desks filled with graduate students, visiting faculty, and industry professionals dressed in tailored suits and confident smiles. At the center stood Professor Daniel Whitmore, a man whose reputation stretched far beyond campus walls, known for brilliance, precision, and a quiet arrogance that filled the room before he even spoke. And then there was Emily Carter, standing near the back, almost invisible in her soft gray cardigan and simple black flats. Her presence barely acknowledged as conversations flowed around her like she didn't belong in the same air. She had slipped in quietly, taking a seat, notebook in hand, listening. Not to impress, not to challenge, but because understanding had always been her quiet refuge. Whitmore's voice cut through the room, sharp and controlled, as he presented his complex theory, equations filling the screen behind him, each symbol reinforcing his authority. Heads nodded. Pens moved. No one questioned him. No one dared. Until a voice, soft, almost hesitant, broke the rhythm. "Excuse me," Emily said, her tone calm but clear enough to shift the room. A few heads turned, puzzled, curious. Whitmore paused, his expression tightening ever so slightly, the interruption unwelcome. "Yes," he replied, already carrying a hint of dismissal. Emily stood slowly, fingers lightly gripping her notebook. "I think there may be an inconsistency in the boundary conditions you applied in Step 4. The room reacted instantly, not with interest, but with amusement. A few students exchanged glances, smirks spreading, whispers rising like static. Whitmore's lips curled into a thin smile, the kind reserved for moments he considered beneath him. "And your name?" he asked, though his tone suggested it didn't matter. "Emily Carter," she answered. "And your department?" A pause. Just long enough. "I work in facilities," she said quietly. The reaction was immediate. Laughter, subtle at first, then louder, emboldened by Whitmore's silence. Someone leaned back, shaking their head. Another whispered something that drew a chuckle. Whitmore exhaled slowly, as if indulging a minor inconvenience. "Facilities," he repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "And you believe you've identified a flaw in a peer-reviewed model?" The laughter grew sharper now, cutting, dismissive. Emily didn't flinch. She didn't look down. She simply nodded once. That was all it took. Whitmore stepped forward slightly, his voice rising just enough to command attention. "Well then," he said, gesturing toward the front. "Why don't you come up here and enlighten us?" The room shifted, anticipation building, not for discovery, but for spectacle, for embarrassment, for proof that she didn't belong. Emily hesitated for half a second, then stepped forward. The sound of her footsteps echoed faintly against the polished floor, each step measured, unhurried. The closer she got, the quieter the room became, not out of respect, but expectation. Whitmore handed her the marker with a faint smirk, stepping aside just enough to give her space, though his posture made it clear he expected this to end quickly. Very quickly. Emily turned to the board, eyes scanning the equations. Her fingers tightened slightly around the marker, then relaxed. Behind her, someone whispered, "This is going to be painful." Another chuckled under their breath. Whitmore folded his arms, waiting, watching, certain. And then she didn't write. Not yet. She just stood there, silent. 3 seconds passed. Then 5. The room began to shift again, discomfort creeping in, the laughter fading into something less certain. Whitmore tilted his head slightly, impatience flickering. "Any time now," he said, his voice edged with quiet mockery. Emily slowly turned her head, looking not at the board, but directly at him. Her eyes were steady, unshaken. And in that moment, something changed, so subtly that most didn't catch it. But it was there. The beginning of something no one in that room had expected. Whitmore held her gaze for a moment longer, expecting hesitation, expecting uncertainty, but Emily did not look away, and that alone unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He let out a short breath, forcing a thin smile as he turned slightly toward the audience, reclaiming control of the room with practiced ease. "Well," he said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement, "we are always open to fresh perspectives." A few quiet laughs followed, though they were less confident now, less certain than before. Emily turned back to the board, her movements calm, almost deliberate, as if the noise behind her had already faded into something distant. She raised the marker and paused again, not out of doubt, but precision, her eyes tracing the structure of the equation, step by step, as though she had seen it long before this moment. Somewhere in the room, a chair shifted. A pen stopped tapping. The air began to change, subtle but undeniable. Whitmore watched closely, arms still folded, his expression composed, but his eyes sharper now, searching for the mistake he was certain would come. "You mentioned step 4, he prompted, his tone measured, though there was an edge beneath it. "Please show us." Emily nodded once, then made her first mark on the board. The sound of the marker against the surface was soft, almost quiet, yet it seemed to echo more loudly than any laughter that had filled the room before. She did not rush. Each line she added connected cleanly to the next, her handwriting steady, controlled. A few students leaned forward, their earlier smirks fading as they followed the logic forming in front of them. One of them frowned, then looked again, as if something did not match what they expected. Whitmore shifted his weight slightly, the smallest adjustment, but enough to signal that his attention had sharpened. Emily stepped slightly to the side, revealing the portion she had just rewritten. "The assumption here," she said, her voice even, "only holds if the boundary conditions remain fixed under transformation." She paused, just long enough for the words to settle. "But they do not." A quiet ripple moved through the audience. Not laughter this time. Something else. Whitmore's smile tightened, though he said nothing. Emily continued, adding another line, then another, each step building on the last with quiet certainty. "If you apply the transformation consistently," she said, "the model begins to contradict itself at this point." She circled a section of the equation, the motion simple, but decisive. A student in the front row leaned closer, eyes narrowing, then slowly sat back, the realization beginning to show. Whitmore uncrossed his arms. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it happened. He stepped forward slightly, scanning the board, his eyes moving quickly, then slowing. For a brief second, his expression faltered. Just a flicker. Then it was gone. "That is an interesting interpretation," he said, though his voice no longer carried the same ease. "But theoretical models often require simplifications." Emily turned to face him again, her expression calm, unchanged. "Yes," she said, "but not ones that break the system you are trying to prove." The room went quieter. No whispers now. No movement. Just attention. Whitmore opened his mouth to respond, already forming the argument, already preparing to dismiss her, but as he glanced back at the board, something held him there. His eyes stopped on the section she had circled, then moved back, then forward again. He inhaled, just slightly, and for the first time since the lecture began, he did not speak immediately. The silence stretched, thin but heavy, and in that space, the balance in the room began to shift, slowly, unmistakably, away from certainty and towards something far more dangerous. Whitmore's silence did not go unnoticed, and in a room that had once been filled with quiet confidence, uncertainty now began to spread like a slow, invisible current. A student in the second row glanced at his notes, then back at the board, his brow furrowing as the contradiction Emily had pointed out refused to disappear. Another shifted in her seat, no longer amused, her eyes fixed on the circled equation as if seeing it for the first time. Emily remained still, her posture relaxed, her hands resting lightly at her sides, as though she had already said everything that needed to be said. But Whitmore had not finished, and his reputation would not allow him to concede so easily. He straightened, drawing in a controlled breath, his voice returning, though now it carried a sharper edge. "Mathematics is not just about identifying inconsistencies," he said, stepping closer to the board. "It is about understanding when those inconsistencies are acceptable within a theoretical framework." He reached for the marker, adding a quick notation beside her correction, his movements faster now, almost urgent. In advanced models, certain deviations are expected. The statement hung in the air, an attempt to reclaim ground, to restore the hierarchy that had defined the room just minutes ago. A few students nodded automatically, more out of habit than conviction. Emily watched him, her expression unchanged, her gaze steady, not confrontational, but unyielding. When he stepped back, She tilted her head slightly, as if considering his response with genuine care. That would be true, she said, her voice calm, measured, if the deviation did not invalidate the conclusion. The room tightened again. Whitmore's jaw set, his fingers curling slightly around the marker. And you are suggesting that it does? He asked, though the question felt less like inquiry and more like a challenge. Emily took a small step forward, closing the distance to the board. I am not suggesting, she replied. I am showing. She lifted the marker once more, this time moving with quiet confidence, her lines more fluid now, each step unfolding with clarity that did not need to be explained twice. She extended the equation beyond where Whitmore had stopped, introducing a transformation that few in the room immediately recognized, yet its logic carried an undeniable weight. A visiting professor in the front row leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, then widening slightly as he followed her progression. The numbers aligned. The structure held. And then, at the final step, the contradiction became undeniable. Emily stepped back, placing the marker down gently, as though the action itself required no emphasis. If the model continues, she said softly, this is the result. No one spoke. Not immediately. The room had reached a point where sound felt almost intrusive, where even breathing seemed louder than it should be. Whitmore stared at the board, his eyes moving slowly now, no longer searching for a simple mistake, but for something deeper, something that would allow him to dismiss what stood in front of him. But the logic was there. Clean. Precise. Unavoidable. A student near the aisle let out a quiet breath he had not realized he was holding. Another lowered her pen completely, no longer pretending to take notes. Whitmore opened his mouth, then closed it again, the words forming but refusing to come out the way they once had so easily. For the first time, the authority he had carried into the room did not fill the space around him. It shrank, just slightly, but enough. Emily did not press further. She did not raise her voice or demand recognition. She simply turned to face him fully, her eyes calm, her presence grounded in something far more stable than reputation. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood, even if they could not yet say it out loud, that the balance had shifted completely, and whatever happened next would not belong to the man who had started this, but to the woman he had underestimated from the very beginning. Whitmore's gaze remained fixed on the board, but something in his posture had changed, something subtle yet impossible to ignore, as if the ground beneath his certainty had shifted just enough to unsettle his balance. The room waited, not with anticipation anymore, but with a quiet tension that pressed against every corner of the space. This was no longer a lecture. It was something else entirely. A test, perhaps, though no one had expected it to turn in this direction. Whitmore finally spoke, but the confidence that once carried his voice had thinned. Your extension assumes a continuity that is not universally accepted, he said, choosing his words carefully now, each one placed with intention. It was not the dismissal he had used before. It was defense. Emily listened without interruption, her expression calm, her attention complete, as though she respected the argument even as she understood its weakness. When he finished, she nodded slightly. That is true, she said. If the model were isolated. A pause. Not hesitation. Precision. But you presented it as predictive. The distinction landed with weight. A professor seated near the front straightened, his eyes moving quickly between Emily and the board. Whitmore's fingers tightened briefly around the marker, then relaxed. He stepped closer again, scanning her work, tracing the path she had laid out, as if hoping to find a fracture, a point where the structure would fail under pressure. But it did not. The logic held. Clean lines. No excess. No room for interpretation. A student in the back slowly closed his laptop, no longer pretending to divide his attention. Another leaned forward, elbows on the desk, fully engaged now, the earlier amusement completely gone. Whitmore exhaled quietly, then turned, not to the board, but to Emily. For a brief moment, the room felt smaller, the distance between them carrying more weight than the space itself. You speak with a great deal of certainty, he said. It was not a compliment. It was a challenge, but softer now, edged with something else. Emily met his gaze without resistance. Only where the logic is clear, she replied. No emphasis. No need. The room absorbed the exchange, every word settling into place like pieces of something larger coming together. Whitmore looked back at the board one more time, his eyes lingering on the final line she had written, the point where his model no longer held. He opened his mouth, ready to respond, ready to reclaim the authority that had defined him for years, but the words did not come as easily as they once had. He began, then stopped, just for a second. But in that second, everything became visible. The hesitation, the doubt, the realization. A faint shift moved through the audience, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. People saw it. They felt it. And once seen, it could not be unseen. Emily did not move. She did not speak. She simply waited, her stillness more powerful than any argument she could have added. The silence stretched again, but this time it carried a different weight, not uncertainty, but recognition. Whitmore finally stepped back, placing the marker down with controlled care, as though maintaining composure in small gestures could restore what had slipped. He turned slightly toward the audience, then paused, his eyes drifting back to Emily one last time. And in that look, there was no longer dismissal, no longer amusement, only the quiet awareness that the moment he had intended to control had become something entirely beyond him, and that whatever came next would not be shaped by authority, but by truth. No one moved at first, as if the room itself needed a moment to adjust to what had just happened, to the quiet but undeniable shift that had taken place right in front of them. Whitmore stood still, his usual composure held together by habit more than certainty now, his eyes drifting once more to the board, then back to Emily, as though confirming what he already knew but had not yet accepted out loud. A faint murmur began somewhere in the back, not laughter, not mockery, but something closer to disbelief, the kind that spreads slowly when people realize they have witnessed something rare. Emily did not react to it. She did not turn, did not acknowledge the attention that had finally found her. She simply stood there, grounded, as if the outcome had never been in question for her. Whitmore cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the low hum, pulling the room back into focus. "It appears," he began, choosing each word with care, "that Miss Carter has provided an alternative perspective." The phrasing was deliberate, an attempt to contain the moment, to frame it within something manageable, something that did not fully surrender control. But the effort was transparent. The audience heard it. They felt it. And they knew. Emily's gaze remained steady, her expression unchanged, not pressing, not correcting, allowing him the space to speak, even now. A professor near the aisle shifted forward, his voice breaking into the silence. "That is not just an alternative," he said, his tone measured but firm. "It is a correction." The words landed heavier than any equation on the board. A few heads nodded. Slowly, then more. Whitmore's jaw tightened slightly, the smallest reaction, but enough to reveal the pressure beneath his calm. He glanced toward the speaker, then back to the board, as if searching for a way to respond that would restore balance. But there was no easy path left. Emily took a quiet breath, then stepped slightly away from the board, creating space not for herself, but for the truth that now stood on its own. She did not need to defend it. It was already clear. Whitmore turned fully toward her, the distance between them now carrying none of the superiority it once had. "You seem very confident in your conclusion," he said, though the edge was gone, replaced by something closer to acknowledgement. Emily met his eyes, calm, composed. "Confidence is not required," she replied softly. "Clarity is." The simplicity of her words settled over the room, heavier than any long explanation could have been. A student near the front let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh of disbelief, though it carried no disrespect now, only recognition. Whitmore held her gaze for a second longer, then looked away, just briefly, as if recalibrating something internal. When he looked back, the expression had changed. Not defeated, not diminished, but altered. "Then perhaps," he said slowly, "you would care to explain how you arrived at that conclusion." It was no longer a challenge. It was an invitation, though it came carefully, cautiously. The room leaned in again, not for spectacle this time, but for understanding. Emily paused, considering him, considering the room, the dozens of faces that had shifted from dismissal to attention. She nodded once. "Of course," she said. And as she turned back toward the board, the silence that followed was no longer heavy with tension, but filled with something else entirely, something earned, something undeniable, something that no one in that room would forget. Emily faced the board once more, but this time the room was no longer behind her as an audience waiting for a mistake. It was with her, leaning in, following every movement with a focus that had replaced doubt entirely. She lifted the marker again, but there was no hesitation now, no pause to gather herself, only a quiet certainty that flowed into every line she wrote. "The issue begins here," she said, her voice steady, clear enough to reach every corner without force. She pointed to the earlier step Whitmore had built his conclusion upon, the foundation that had once seemed unquestionable. "This assumption treats the boundary as static," she continued, drawing a simple line beneath it, separating it from what came next. "But the moment you introduce transformation, the boundary changes with it." A few students nodded instinctively, their eyes moving quickly as they began to follow the shift in logic. Emily continued, not rushing, allowing each step to settle before moving forward. "If the boundary changes," she said, extending the equation further, "then the original constraint no longer applies in the same way." She rewrote the condition, cleaner, more precise, removing the hidden contradiction that had gone unnoticed before. The visiting professor in the front row leaned back slowly, a faint expression of recognition crossing his face, as if something long understood had finally been articulated in a way that could not be ignored. Emily stepped slightly to the side, revealing the full progression, then added one final line, connecting everything together with a clarity that did not require explanation. "And once you account for that," she said softly, "the outcome shifts." The room remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of tension. It was the silence of understanding forming in real time. Pens moved again, but differently now, not out of obligation, but urgency, as students tried to capture what they were witnessing before it slipped away. Whitmore stood just a few feet behind her, his eyes fixed on the board, following each step with a focus that mirrored the rest of the room, but carried something deeper beneath it. He was not searching for errors anymore. He was verifying truth. Emily lowered the marker, placing it gently on the ledge, and turned back to face him. She did not speak immediately. She did not need to. The work stood on its own. Whitmore inhaled slowly, his shoulders rising just slightly, then falling as he exhaled. He stepped forward, closing the distance to the board, his eyes scanning the sequence once more, slower this time, deliberate, as though committing it to memory. A faint murmur passed through the audience, not disruptive, but filled with quiet realization. The model had changed. Not slightly, fundamentally. Whitmore straightened, turning halfway toward the room, then pausing, as if weighing his next words carefully, aware now that every sentence carried more than just information, it carried consequence. He looked at Emily again, really looked this time, not at her clothes, not at her role, but at the clarity she had brought into a space that had not expected her to matter. "Your revision," he said finally, his voice steady, though no longer elevated above the room, "is correct." The words landed without resistance, without embellishment, and because of that, they carried more weight than any defense he could have offered. A quiet shift moved through the audience again, but this time it was unmistakable. Respect. Emily gave a small nod, not triumphant, not relieved, simply acknowledging the truth as it was spoken. And in that moment, the room understood something far beyond equations and models, something that lingered in the silence that followed, something that could not be undone. The words lingered in the air long after Whitmore spoke them, not because they were loud, but because they were undeniable, and for a man whose authority had always rested on certainty, that quiet admission carried more weight than anything he had said all morning. The room did not erupt into applause or reaction. It simply held the moment, as if everyone understood that what had just happened was not meant to be interrupted. Emily stood where she was, composed, her posture unchanged, as though the outcome had never been about recognition. A student near the front slowly set his pen down, his eyes still fixed on the board, then shifted to her, seeing her now in a way he had not before. Another leaned toward his classmate and whispered something, but it was not mockery this time. It was awe, quiet and sincere. Whitmore remained still for a second longer, then stepped slightly aside, creating space not out of obligation, but acknowledgement. It was a small gesture, But in that room, it meant everything. Emily noticed it, though she did not react outwardly. Instead, she glanced briefly at the equations one last time, as if ensuring that what needed to be said had already been said. Then she turned, not toward Whitmore, but toward the audience, the dozens of faces now watching her with a level of attention she had never sought. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was no longer heavy. It was clear, almost weightless, filled with understanding rather than tension. Whitmore finally shifted his stance, his voice returning, though now it carried none of the earlier edge. "Would you care," he said, pausing slightly as if choosing the correct words mattered more than ever before, "to share how you developed this approach?" It was not a demand. It was not a test. It was respect, carefully expressed, but real. Emily looked at him, then at the room, considering the question not as a challenge, but as an invitation to clarify something deeper. "It is not a new approach," she said softly. "It is just one that is often overlooked." A few heads tilted, curiosity replacing assumption. She took a small breath, then continued, her voice steady, grounded. "When you spend enough time working around systems, maintaining them, observing where they fail, you begin to see patterns that are not always visible from a distance." The statement was simple, but it carried layers that settled gradually over the audience. Whitmore listened closely now, not as a lecturer, but as someone learning, his focus no longer on defending, but understanding. Emily's gaze moved briefly across the room, taking in the faces that had once dismissed her, not with resentment, but with quiet clarity. "Complex models are not just built," she added. "They are lived with." The words lingered, drawing a different kind of silence, one that reached beyond equations and into something more human. A professor near the aisle nodded slowly, as if recognizing a truth that extended beyond the subject itself. Whitmore lowered his gaze briefly, then looked back at her, and in that look, there was no trace of the earlier dismissal, only a quiet respect that had been earned in the simplest and most undeniable way. Emily gave a small nod, not seeking approval, not claiming victory, just acknowledging the moment as it was. And in that moment, the room did not just see her differently, it understood something it had overlooked from the very beginning. The room did not return to what it had been before, because something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone by simply moving on to the next slide or the next topic. People sat differently now, more attentive, more aware, as if the air itself carried a quiet reminder that certainty could be fragile when built on assumptions. Whitmore turned slowly toward the audience, his posture still composed, but no longer elevated above them, no longer protected by the invisible distance that authority once created. "We will take a brief pause," he said, his voice measured, though softer than before, as if recalibrated by the moment. No one moved immediately. They were not waiting for instruction anymore. They were processing. A few students exchanged glances, not the quick, dismissive looks from earlier, but longer, thoughtful ones, as if silently asking each other if they had seen what they thought they had seen. Emily stepped back from the center, not retreating, but returning to the space she had originally occupied, her movements quiet, unassuming, as if she had never intended to stand at the front at all. Yet now, even as she moved, eyes followed her, not out of curiosity, but recognition. A young man near the aisle hesitated before speaking, his voice low but clear enough to carry. "How long have you been studying this?" he asked, the question simple but sincere. Emily paused, turning slightly toward him, considering the answer not as a performance, but as truth. "A long time," she said, "just not always in places like this." The response settled gently, but it carried weight, inviting reflection without demanding it. Another student leaned forward. "Why have we never heard of your work?" he asked, not with skepticism, but genuine confusion. Emily gave a small, almost thoughtful smile, the kind that did not seek attention. "Because I was not trying to be heard," she replied. "I was trying to understand." The room grew quiet again, but this time it felt different, more personal, as if each person was considering what that meant in their own way. Whitmore stood a few steps away, listening, his gaze steady, not interrupting, not reclaiming the space, but allowing it to unfold in a way he had not planned. A visiting professor rose slowly from his seat, adjusting his jacket as he spoke. "Miss Carter, he said, his tone respectful. Your analysis deserves to be published. The statement did not echo loudly, but it resonated deeply, sending a ripple through the room. Emily looked at him, then glanced briefly at the board, as if measuring the idea against something internal. Perhaps, she said, her voice calm, if it helps others see more clearly. There was no ambition in her tone, no urgency, only purpose. Whitmore took a small step forward, stopping just short of where she stood. It would, he said quietly, and for the first time, there was no distance between them, no hierarchy, only acknowledgement. Emily met his gaze, then nodded once, accepting the statement not as validation, but as shared understanding. Around them, the room remained still, not because there was nothing to say, but because what had been said already mattered more. And in that stillness, the lesson extended beyond equations and expertise, settling into something far more lasting, something that would remain long after the lecture ended, long after the room emptied, long after the moment itself had passed. People began to move again, slowly at first, as if breaking out of a shared stillness that had held them longer than any lecture ever could. But the usual sounds of shuffling papers and quiet conversations carried a different tone now, softer, more thoughtful, as though everyone was aware that something important had just unfolded and they were not quite ready to let it go. Emily stepped back toward the aisle, her movements calm, unhurried, blending once more into the space she had entered so quietly, yet nothing about her presence felt invisible anymore. Students glanced at her as she passed, some offering small nods, others simply watching with a kind of quiet respect that needed no words. Whitmore remained near the front, his attention lingering on the board where the corrected model still stood, unchanged, undeniable. For a long moment, he did not move, as if committing every detail to memory, not out of obligation, but out of recognition that this moment would stay with him far beyond this room. A colleague approached him, speaking in a low voice, but Whitmore barely responded, his focus still drawn back to the equations, to the clarity that had replaced certainty. Emily reached the back of the room, gathering her notebook, the same simple one she had carried in without notice, and for a brief second, she paused, her eyes lifting toward the front again. Whitmore turned at that exact moment, their gazes meeting across the distance, no longer divided by status or assumption, but connected by something quieter, something earned. He gave a small nod, not formal, not performative, but genuine. Emily returned it, just as simply, then turned toward the exit. The door opened with a soft sound, and as she stepped into the hallway, the noise of the room faded behind her, replaced by the calm rhythm of footsteps echoing against polished floors. Inside, the lecture hall slowly returned to motion, but it was not the same room anymore. Conversations were different. Questions were different. Even the silence, when it came again, carried a deeper awareness. Whitmore finally stepped away from the board, turning to face the audience once more, but there was no attempt to reclaim authority, no need to assert control. Instead, he looked out at them, his expression thoughtful, almost reflective. What we witnessed today, he said, his voice steady, though quieter than it had ever been, was not just a correction. He paused, letting the words settle. It was a reminder. No one interrupted. No one shifted. They listened. Whitmore's gaze moved briefly toward the door Emily had just exited through, then back to the room. Clarity does not belong to position, he continued. And understanding is not always found where we expect it. The words lingered, not as a conclusion, but as something open, something that extended beyond the walls of the lecture hall. A student slowly closed his notebook, not because the lecture had ended, but because something else had begun. Outside, Emily walked down the hallway, her pace steady, her expression unchanged, as if the moment behind her had simply been another step in a path she had already chosen long ago. She did not look back. She did not need to. And somewhere behind her, in a room that would never feel quite the same again, the silence returned one last time, not empty, but full, carrying a truth that no one there would forget, a truth that had been spoken without force, without pride, and yet had changed everything.